Welcome to day 4 of week 9, where we're graphing linear functions, continuing on with SOL 8.16d, where the students will graph a linear function given the equation in y equals mx plus b form. Yesterday's independent practice and homework asked for you to, using the slope-intercept form y equals mx plus b, you were supposed to identify the slope and the y-intercept. You're supposed to write the equation of the line using the slope and y-intercept in slope-intercept form. So for number 1, you were given the slope of 4/5 and the y-intercept of -8. So remember, your slope is what your m variable is, and your y-intercept represents the b in that equation. What determines if you're adding or subtracting is if the y-intercept is negative or positive. If it's positive, you're adding. If it's negative, you are subtracting. With that being said, for number 1, we have a slope of 4/5 and a y-intercept of -8. So your equation should be y equals 4/5 x minus 8. Number 2, your slope is -1 and your y-intercept is -5. With that being said, your equation should be y equals -x minus 5. Remember, there's no need to write the actual 1 because the variable itself represents 1. Number 3, your slope was 7/5 and your y-intercept is -2. That equation should equate to y equals 7/5 x minus 2. And the last one is 7/6 as your slope and your y-intercept of -8. So that equals y equals 7/6 x minus 8. Today's objective, I can identify the slope and y-intercept from an equation written in slope-intercepts form. Materials needed: notebook, lined paper, and a pencil. A review of this week's vocabulary is as follows: linear function, slope, positive slope, negative slope, zero slope, undefined slope, slope-intercept form of a linear equation, and y-intercept. We ask that you please pause to go over the instructional notes that are here. Just as a reminder, there's some information that is located here as far as reminding you of where the slope is, where the y-intercept is. Remember, your slope is represented by the variable m, and your y-intercept is represented by the variable b. So in looking at these equations that are here, this is just giving you a brief review of how to locate the slope and y-intercept when you're looking at it in the slope-intercept form. We're now going to move on to our independent practice, and this is your first example. Identify the slope, which is m, and the y-intercept, which is b, for each of the 2 examples. Please pause the video at this time, write down your answers for each one of those questions, and resume so that we can go over the explanation with you.
Let's look at the solution to example 1. In example 1, both of the equations have the slope circled as well as the y-intercept. Notice in the first equation, the slope is a fraction, and so it is just the portion of the equation that is in front of the x, or we call that the coefficient. So the slope in the first equation is -5/2. The y-intercept in the first equation, notice it has a minus or subtraction sign in front of it, which makes it negative. So in the first equation, our y-intercept is b equals -5. In the second equation, our slope is -3. Now, if we were to use that in a graph, we could write it as a fraction as -3/1. But here we're just identifying it. So our slope is -3. For our y-intercept in the second equation, it says +1, so it would be positive. So our y-intercept in the second equation is b equals 1.
Here is example number 2. You are asked to do the same as with example 1. You are using these 2 equations to identify the slope and the y-intercept for each. Please pause the video, write down your responses, then resume the slideshow so that we can go over the answers together.
Let's look at the solution to example 2. In example 2, we need to look at the given equations and determine the slope and the y-intercept. Let's start with the first equation. In the first equation, we can see here that we do not have a number that we can see in front of the x or as the coefficient. However, you've learned before that if there's a coefficient you cannot see, that is understood to be a 1. So I'm just going to put a 1 here for our coefficient. So again, if there's not a number that you can see as the coefficient of x, it's understood to be a 1. So when we want to determine the slope of this first equation, the slope would be 1. That would be this number here. And the y-intercept would be 7. Let's look here at the second equation. In the second equation, the coefficient of the x, which is 1/4, would be our slope. And we know we like our slope to be written in fraction form if we can, so we can have that rise over run. We're going to use it for graphing. And then the y-intercept would be -2 because we had the subtraction sign. So notice here when we had the addition sign, it was +7. And with the subtraction sign, it becomes negative, as in -2.
And here is example 3. You're still identifying the slope and y-intercept for both of these equations. Please pause the videos, record your responses, and resume when you have completed the task.
Let's look at the solution for example 3. In example 3, we can see here in this first equation that, again, we have a negative sign, but we don't have a number that is visible as our coefficient. So like in the previous example, when there's no number visible, the coefficient is understood to be a 1. In this instance, because we have the negative sign, the coefficient here is actually -1. So here, our slope is equal to -1. Our y-intercept is 3. And remember, we said this 3 is positive because it has a plus sign. If it would have been minus, it would have been negative. So here our slope is -1 and our y-intercept is 3. Let's look at the second equation. In the second equation, we have y equals 2x. So we can easily find the slope because the slope is the coefficient of the x term. So here our slope is 2. Now, normally we would have plus something for our y-intercept, but we don't have anything. And we know in math, when we don't have anything, that is the same as 0. So because we don't have anything here for our visible for our y-intercept, that our y-intercept would be 0.
Now, let's move on to our practice and homework problems for today. We'd ask that you take a look at all 3 of these questions, given the equation, and identify the slope and y-intercept for each. We will go over the solutions to these at the top of tomorrow's session. So please pause the slideshow at this time, respond to these questions, and we will go over them tomorrow. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to respond to your homework. Thank you for joining us. We'd ask that you now log in through your Clever account to complete at least one Dreambox lesson. If you have a chance or opportunity to complete more than one, that will be awesome, but at least complete one Dreambox activity today in your Clever account. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to working with you tomorrow.